Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are just getting started with the Business of Alt Protein monthly seminar. If folks, as they're trickling in, would like to enter into the chat where they're calling in from, we'd love to see who we have on the call. I'm calling in from San Francisco today. And my name is Audrey Geer. I'm a Startup Innovation Specialist at the Good Food Institute. And today we'll be learning how to create a B2B marketing strategy for your novel protein ingredient. There have been a plethora of companies emerging to create new sustainable proteins, but it can be challenging when going to market with these new products. So today's webinar will dive into how to market your product B2B. Before we begin today, I do have just a few housekeeping items. First of all, for those that are unfamiliar, the Good Food Institute is an international nonprofit organization that is developing the roadmap for sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, we mobilize resources and talent, and we empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and of course, delicious. Second, this seminar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. We will be sending a copy of the recording to everyone who registered, and you can also view our previous seminars on our YouTube channel. Third, this seminar will include an audience Q&A for the last part of the hour. We do ask that you send in your questions via the Q&A box rather than the chat. That helps us keep track of them better. You are welcome to ask your questions throughout the seminar, but we will likely only have time to address them at the end. And finally, immediately following this seminar, we will be hosting a virtual networking session via the Meetaway platform. We'll drop the link in the chat that will take you to the registration page where you can sign up if you haven't already. And this is just a great way to meet other professionals in the alt protein industry. You'll be matched with folks from one-on-one conversations. I know that I've met some fantastic people at these mixers, and I really encourage you all to join us. Just remember, you do need to sign up via Meetaway, and this will start at the top of the hour once the seminar ends. So with that, let's dive into today's seminar. I am delighted to welcome Bright Green Partners. They are a leading alternative protein consultancy who will take their best practices and lessons learned to provide you with a framework on the steps, activities, and timelines required for developing a successful go-to-market strategy for novel protein ingredients. We are joined today by Flor, who is a co-founder and managing partner at Bright Green Partners. Welcome, Flor. I will now hand it over to you to take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And hi, everyone. My name is indeed Flor. My last name is Buitelaar, which is always a bit harder to pronounce for non-Dutch people because I'm Dutch and living in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I'm very excited to be presenting here today to you. Our Good Food Institute is a huge support as we see it to the industry, and therefore I'm super happy to be contributing my part today and hopefully to support you on your go-to-market journey. Before we get into this topic, I will tell a bit about Bright Green Partners, and then we will talk you through the actual B2B go-to-market strategy. And as Audrey did highlight, there's time for Q&A at the end, about 20 minutes. So if you have any questions to anything I'm saying or comments, then please drop them in the chat. We can have a look back at the slides later on. And anyways, I will share my email address at the end, and you can find me on LinkedIn, as well as my colleague Oliver, who contributed well to my talk today. So we're more than happy to take any questions from you. First of all, Bright Green Partners. We are a global consultancy, as Audrey said, we're only focusing on alt protein. That means that we focus on plant-based fermentation and cell-based technologies. And that means also that we mostly focus on meat and dairy related products and markets. Within that, you can think of fish, of course, of intermediate ingredients or technologies or final products. So basically, we cover the whole value chain from raw material production to processing, and in the end, then how to go to market to, for example, retail or food service products. And that's, of course, highly related to what we're talking about today. We believe, and our clients as well, that our unique value is in to combine typical management consulting backgrounds combined with our expert network and the companies that we are in touch with, such as the startups out there, which I saw a lot of are joining today as well, because we've built our own expert network of over 1,500 very knowledgeable people in the field. So whether it's a very particular topic on cellular agriculture, amino acids, or whether it's a certain plant-based technology, we can cover those topics for you because we combine those two areas of expertise on all our projects, no matter what the topic is. As I just said, I'm based in Europe and the rest of our core team is as well. So we are a European-based company, but we actually work for companies and also together with our experts all over the globe. So we have a global presence. And we do that because we work remote. We think that we love to travel, but we think it's also not that sustainable to do it all the time if we would fly all across the world to our clients. So that's why we work remote and can work basically on every topic and for every company out there. And that also means that I will just move first to the clients part because most of our clients are large or medium-sized corporates. Consider, for example, large FMCG companies where we work for. But we also work on more raw material and agriculture and of those corporates, as well as governments and investors. We're very happy to be working for them and to contribute to the alt protein scene. And we do that with our services. Those vary also from whether it's strategy, so alt protein strategy, for example, whether it's particular technical requests that come in, or even innovation projects such as startup scouting and partnership building, as well as go-to-market strategies, what we're going to talk about today. The last slide about BGP is around why then companies actually work with Bright Green Partners. Well, at the moment, we can tell that there is no company like BGP out there. So that, of course, makes it already easier to answer for us. But definitely our thought leadership and or methodologies that are built, particularly around the alternative meat and dairy industry, is that we can go very deep with our knowledge, combined with the typical management consulting approaches as you would expect from other firms. So that combination is the real value add to our clients. And also we build quite some partnerships and our own knowledge base, obviously from the past projects and the research that we're doing internally. And we were very pleased to work, for example, with Good Food Institute today, but also with other of the critical partners in the industry together to help our clients in the best way we can. And sometimes we like to help the community as well, as in today's seminar. If any questions on this, you can, of course, check out our website or our LinkedIn, but also let me know if you have particular questions. I would be happy to get in touch with you. Then let's dive into the actual topic of today, because I've been asked to talk about go-to-market strategy. And before I will open the content slides, I have about 6 or 7 of those where I will talk you through. A few words up front, because there are some framing topics here already in the title, B2B. So that means that we look at only ingredient companies today with novel protein ingredients. And also the word novel protein can, of course, have several explanations to it. So when we talk, in this case, novel protein ingredients, with our focus at Bright Green Partners, we talk only alt protein ingredients. While with novel protein, that of course doesn't have to mean that it's only alternative protein related. It can have, for example, animal-based sources as well. Those are excluded for today, but in general, the same logic could be applied to it as well. Then we're mostly talking functional ingredients here. You will hear me talking quite a lot about functionality today, and that's because we considered rather functional ingredients. Consider, for example, egg white replacers are very functional ingredients. We're not talking commodity or bulk ingredients like wheat or sugar here, because that would have a way less focus on functionality and applications than what we're going to discuss today. With novel, most of you will also think about regulatory, and if you don't, then at least the regulatory authorities out there in the world will consider this. Novel for the regulatory authorities is not something that they particularly like, especially here in Europe. We're also pretty strict about that. So it can be quite a limitation to your ingredient, even though that it can have such great functionality. And this will definitely influence your go-to-market strategy, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So do keep this in mind that if your ingredient turns out to be applicable to novel food laws, then the framework that I'm going to talk you through might have some hurdles along the way. Then the next point and last point I want to make before actually diving into the content is that we will talk you through, based on our experience and our main method around go-to-market strategies today. But of course, there are several options and variables to it. Let's say you're rather a commercial company, maybe corporate, and you already have your brand and your distribution in place, then there might be some elements that are rather less relevant than when you are a startup and you're heavily focused on the technical part. So your functionality is there, you know your applications, you know exactly what's in your ingredients, but the whole marketing and the whole commercial area and the actual addressing to your target customers and your audience is not there yet. So there are quite some variances. And that's what we exactly do to our clients. We help them guide through this process, see what they already have, and build upon that to support them in the best way. The first slide that I show is also the maybe most overwhelming slide. There's quite some text on this slide, and I will talk you through it. Because basically what we've done in preparation for this session is to put all the major areas that we foresee within a go-to-market strategy, those are 12 key steps, on this page to talk you through. So no worries, I'm going to talk you through. And it might look overwhelming, but at least we at BGP think that go-to-market strategies are a lot of fun. And why is it so important to have this go-to-market strategy framework in your mind? It's basically because it helps you to guide through validating your market fit of your particular ingredients and how that fits to the general market, next to your competitors, to customers. And that will also help you defining the best positioning in the market that you can address or that you can have in order to fulfill your customer needs, and for that also the right price, of course, because you don't want to outprice or have a too low price with your product in the end, because that makes whether you're viable in the market in the end or not. So let me talk you through those 12 steps, and we will end this presentation with a final slide on the timeline actually, so that will come a bit later. To start off, we have the functionality testing of raw and processed ingredients, because we believe that if you're talking a novel protein ingredient here, there should be a real edge to why customers would pick your ingredient over another one. And that all starts with functionality. If it doesn't work as you promised them, it will not work because they will not buy it. Why should they buy, for example, for a higher price, your ingredient than others? So it all starts with functionality. You need to know what's inside in your ingredient and where you can use it for. And you need to have predefined parameters for that. There are typical ones in the market, which I'm not going to list all today. This overview is in general non-exhaustive, but I'm sure either you have those already or we can help you with that. And you need to have access to a lab to actually do the testing, obviously. So the first step will help you to understand what's actually inside your ingredient and what the benefits could be of having it. Let's say you now know it foams. Great. The next step you have to take is the chemical and microbiology testing, because you want to make sure that there's no unwanted element in your ingredient, which might actually limit that you cannot go to market. You want to know this earlier on, and maybe you have to go back to the iteration of your processing or so, because we're assuming the processing has already been done before, and that's totally another R&D work package, not necessarily here in the go-to-market one. But then you might have to go back. Otherwise, this will really be an obstacle also to the, if it's a novel food, to the approval later on, because it can, of course, not go to the market if there are, let's say, heavy metals inside. So that's done. Functionality and the general chemical microbiology testing. But now you want to know, based on, let's say, it foams again, where can you actually use this into? So what's the application of your ingredient? Which products can it be integrated into? Because that will in the end help you with defining your products and your target markets and your customers as well. So the application. Think of an end application. So let's say it's a croissant or it's a meringue where you can use the foaming element into, for the meringue particularly, in realistic scenarios, of course. You might consider actually having it for total new applications, as is maybe more the case with cultured meat. But if you are really already from the first start thinking of, I want to replace an egg white ingredient, then you actually also already have an indication of which applications it can go into. For example, the bakery market. So you know in which it works, and it might actually turn out to be different when you're going to test to integrate it into a recipe with step 3 application testing than what you originally thought. Then there might be something wrong with your ingredient, or maybe with the recipe, or you need to look deeper into why it's not working. But this information will be key not only to yourself to know which markets you're going to target, but also later on when you are talking to your customers, you know everything about your ingredient and you can really support their R&D department and also sales department with making the decision of your ingredient over the other one, because you can offload their R&D work on how to actually use the ingredient best. So this is super valuable, not only internally, but really make sure that you note down the findings well, and ideally make some sales brochure or something for your clients to convince them why they should pick you based on the functionality and the application. By then, you also have a good understanding of which products it can already go into, and therefore also already some kind of indication around the markets where it can go into. Because if you know it goes into meringues, cake, croissants, then you definitely know you can target the bakery market. And there might be other markets. So basically what's then to be done is a value chain analysis. If it's just one market, you can do one value chain analysis. If it's several ones, then you need to do several market value chain analyses. I will show you an example actually on the next slide, so I will not go too much into here. We will get to that part, but it's basically covering from upstream to downstream to understand how that market looks like. And in that way, on the next step, the competitor analysis, you will also know from which ingredients and which steps mostly your competitors are active. So with the competitor analysis, you want to know not only the companies that are competitors to you, so what type of companies, but also based on the ingredient, you're mostly reflecting that. So who else is providing egg white replacers? That's relevant to know because then you can also see their price levels or get an indication in the market, as well as who they are targeting. And there might be actually a sweet spot which they're not addressing at the moment. The next step, number 6, is to define your target market. So based on the steps in the value chain, based on your own functionality and application, as well as the competitors, you will know already which markets it can be used into, which markets are still pretty relevant because there's maybe less competition or more, and that's a market that's going to be relevant for you. And you need to have those target markets ready because otherwise you're going to do endless amount of work of the next steps, which you might want to limit from day one, of course. There might be an iterative session that you first start with a few, you review them. You might want to add 1 or 2 later on, but generally we agree to narrow it down to target markets or industries sooner than later. Based on those target markets, you can also define your USP because you know what the market generally is looking for, where it's being used into, you know where your competitors are focusing on, and you want to have a typical USP ready, so a unique selling point for your products. That comes together with also defining market attractiveness and the customer segmentation in steps 8 and 9. So there's a bit, you will see that in the timeline, usually those are slightly combined. So you should not see this as, oh, it only goes sequential. No, some of them are actually quite simultaneously happening. If we look at the market attractiveness, this can be a real go, no-go element. So even though you decided on target markets, ideally you want to address those. There might be critical signs that you see during the market attractiveness assessment around that a market is actually less attractive than you thought because there's no growth, but actually reducing market demand, or there's so many new entrants and the barriers to entrance to the market are so low that it's going to be a tough market and the price will mostly go down anyway. Of course, the more technical market is, the less this topic will be relevant or will be crucial, but still it's very relevant to do this, especially if you have investors on board or you have to convince your higher seniors up there. It's good to bring a documentation around why you think that this market is going to be profitable, because in the end, most of the companies here are not only to do good in the world, but especially also to make a good profit margin. And then the market attractiveness is very relevant. Point number 9 is the customer segmentation and the target customers then that you want to address. So you want to have a look within those markets and within the value chain around who your customers are going to be. I will show that also based on the value chain and the differences it could bring with if you are a pilot stage, whether you're a startup, scale up, large company, whether you're at full production already, because that might change the customer that you're going to target. But generally, it's important that you do not only look at it from your own ingredient perspective and what the customer needs, whether it addresses that, but also internal KPIs that you have. If you already know you have to sell millions of tons, then maybe addressing only startups is not going to work. So that can be a critical cutoff point. Point number 10 is around the brand strategy. So based on your USP and the market attractiveness and so on, the customers that you want to target, you have to define also your brand in the market. It might depend if you decide that you're actually going to provide this only to ingredient houses, then of course you still need a name to your company, but there is maybe less or more branding required than when you would actually address B2C companies that will provide to the consumer. In general, of course, B2B market is totally different than B2C marketing. I will not dive deeper into that here today, but definitely a good topic to dive into. The last 2 points before actually being in the market is price and SKU definition. So once you know all the things about your ingredient, who you're going to target, you also need to know who by then who will buy it, and therefore also the price levels and the amounts that they will usually buy from competitors and what you can charge. If you're sending it to startups, then you probably don't want to pack it in 1,000 kilo ranges in your SKU. If you might have to send it in 1 kilo or 5 kilo bags. So that's something to really consider because it can have a huge impact also on your cash flow, as well as on the shelf life and the risks that you take with that. You don't want to end up with 2 big bags that are not being sold, because that means waste in the end and not good impact for your financials either. And then the last thing is, once you know all that, you have to get the products, of course, via distribution setup, whether you do that in-house or whether you do that via partner or you just sell it directly. Someone will pick it up from your place. So distribution is super important, and that also influences on which sales channels you're actually going to target. And I will dive deeper into those elements, the distribution, the sales, but also the customers in general, the value chain now in the following slides. So generally, if you have the value chain from upstream to downstream, we see 4 major elements. Of course, you can detail this out further, but 4 major elements into the value chain, from raw material to processing to distribution channels and B2B end customers, before it actually goes to the consumer, so B2C. And I also want to mention that from raw material to ingredient here and then to processing, that differs because some of the companies have very simple extraction or purification methods. Some have very technical components to it. So this is very simplified. And with the processing step, that might also differ. So some of the companies will do that in-house. So if you follow this stream, basically you start with a raw material, no matter what that then will be, because it differs with plant-based fermentation cultured. And you go to initial ingredient, but that might not be ready before you actually use it later on in your end application. So you have to process it. Some of the companies want to do that in-house and then sell later on the product to their customers, which can be via the distribution channels. You can directly sell it to them, or you can use them to actually sell it to B2B end customers in this overview. So that's how you should see the logic of this overview. But within processing, there are already few steps. So the first one is the in-house processing, as I just said. You basically own the process. The other one is that you could do it together with a selected partner. So those can help you process the ingredient into a final ingredient from your side. But you could also outsource it to even a co-man, depending on whether that co-man already even exists in the market. It depends on the maturity of the industry. And you could have an ingredient supplier actually doing it for you. If it's not such a technical process, then they could even do it. And with that, they actually buy already the ingredient for you and your hands are off from your ingredient at that moment. That's a sales step. Then the following process is the distribution channel. So from processing, it will be handed over. It's an ingredient now, and it can go to market. But how do you get it to that market? That's the distribution part we just talked about at step 12, from distribution to sales. So there are a few options here. If you look at the last one, its own sales team. You can, of course, do it yourself. And I have a slide comparing an own sales team versus sales agents later on in my talk. So you can compare those, of course. But you can also work with other partnership methods or allies, as we call it. For example, with blenders, distributors, and ingredient suppliers. So they can either as a blender, they can use it into their own formulations, bring it back and you can sell it, or another distributor will then sell it for you so that it's a total package you're offering to maybe a FMCG, a Unilever, or a Nestle, or whatever it would be. But you could also use a distributor or any ingredient supplier basically for you to bring it to market. And then you don't have to do the whole marketing and branding around it. Of course, they have to find you and they have to see the relevance in you, but you don't have to bring it to the final step, B2B end customers. The sales agents and own sales team is something I will detail out in, I believe, the next slide or the slide after. But lastly, the B2B end customers. So there are several types here, depending on which market you're targeting. And again, it also depends on which positioning you want in the market. So it might be the case that you actually end already as being an ingredient supplier and you don't even address this. And you have an indication of where your product is going to, but then it's up to the distributor where it actually lands in the end. But if you have your own sales team or sales agent, it's super relevant to know who your B2B end customer would be. Because as I shared on the previous slide, that also depends on who your customer is, what the price could be, how your distribution will look like, your SKUs, and so on. So to give a few of those examples, it can be an FMCG who has final products that go to the consumer, similar as with SMEs. Think of bakery houses, FMCGs, the Nestle's and the Unilevers of this world, who bring maybe plant-based meat to the market, but also startups, of course. And we will show some advantages of working with startups versus FMCGs on the next slide as well. Then there are also co-manufacturers because they actually supply retailers in some cases. So they buy some of their ingredients themselves as well. Could be relevant to look into, especially because they have quite a large scale. So if you have a very typical ingredient that they use, then it's definitely relevant to look into that. There can also be ingredient companies or wholesalers. So if you, for example, make a protein powder that goes directly into sports nutrition, then this could be something to look into because it's already a final ingredient then. Depends, of course, then it still has to be novel. So this might be a more challenging route with a novel ingredient than with just a bulk ingredient. And lastly, you could supply to retail or food service and also wholesalers, in this case, yourself, and then they bring it to the consumer. Because some of the retailers actually have their own branch and production, such as in Switzerland, for example, where you could supply this to. The next slide will now show the make, buy, ally, and sell, basically, that I've been integrating into my talk in the last few minutes. Because as you see it, we've aligned this with colors. And don't worry, you also get the slides afterwards. So if you want to look in more detail into this, you can. But basically, you can either make the in-house processing or buy it, depending on whether it's, of course, already available on the market and depending on your financial status, if that's even an option. But anyway, you need to have some sort of processing, or you need to have a distribution channel, and you need to have a sales channel, of course. And that's basically what we show on this slide, the 4 steps to getting to the processing capability, to getting to the distribution capabilities, and how where to sell in the end. And depending on your own strategy, there are several routes, as you see here, and several options to do that. And also how far integrated into the value chain you want to be. Because if you argue like we're the best growers of a raw material, if it's being grown even, and we only want to focus on that, and we want to focus maybe even on the seed or crop innovation of that, then there might be no sense to go all the way to B2B end customers and so closely to the consumer. There might be other companies who can actually do the processing way better than you can. So that could be an option. And then you just sell it, that processing step already. But there could also, so then you're rather an agricultural player. But it could also be the case that you actually do want to control the whole value chain and you want to know where it ends into, and that will help you doing the innovation in your maybe crop and in your ingredient and in the processing to optimize it constantly, to keep up with the market trends, and to help your customers the best way you can. So that's all about why we see that there's a make, buy, ally, and sell opportunity, and why we show this in a couple of major steps and variations of routes that you can pick and play. So that's critical within your B2B go-to-market strategy, as I showed in those 12 steps, to really keep in mind how far integrated do I want to be in the value chain, and where is my core strength of my company. Potentially you have several components already running or several business activities. So you want to keep it close to your core. Maybe you want to expand that. That's something to really keep in mind when expanding to this activity or when you're building your company. Then I said I would dive into the customer groups. And on the next slide, I will also compare some of the distribution options that I just been talking about. And generally what we see is that there's quite a difference between pilot production, when you actually have some of the ingredients already there. Lab doesn't really make sense, of course. Laboratory work is purely for yourself, and maybe some initial testing with potential clients to get some market traction, but not necessarily to actually produce. So from pilot production to full production, we see that there is actually quite a difference between target audience or your customers that you can address. Because and we see that more often happening, that companies are very ambitious, which is not a bad thing at all, unless your execution is also relying on that. If you do not have the production ready and you make nice promises to the market, and yes, we will have this by Q4 this year, we're going to supply you tons of ingredients to you, and then you close a nice deal, and actually you don't have the ingredient yet, and you just close the deal with one of the biggest players in the world. Well, that's not wise, because you only get a chance once, and once you actually screwed up, you do not get a second chance anymore, because your worth will not be taken or will not be believed anymore. So our recommendation is really make sure you have your pilot production ready, use that to do initial testing in the market to get some traction. We show some examples here in the overview of if you would, for example, target plant-based cheese with a particular ingredient, and you want to, for example, target brands, if that's a recommendation we would give or you would find yourself, then start mostly with the startups and the SMEs. They need smaller volumes than the corporates out there, which can be a limitation when you grow later on to full production. But it will definitely help you to already secure first financials coming in, to get feedback from them, and to show to your investors, if that's the case, like, hey, this is actually working, because they continue buying from us and they're happy with our ingredients. They're way more flexible, startups and SMEs, to work with, so you can use the data also to build further on your storytelling, and at the same time you can work on getting up to your production. Of course, if you're corporate here today listening in, you might think, yeah, well, that's nice, and so we already have all the distribution, all the sales channels with the other corporates. We don't want to get into the startups and SMEs. Then that's great, of course, that's fantastic. But still, you need to know that you have the production to actually deliver those, because otherwise you might have such great relationships already, but they will not be pleased either when there's an out of stock and they cannot produce at that moment, because you have to consider that also a potential out of stock to your client is super expensive and a high risk for them. So they don't want to have that happening. Also, maybe a small side note here is what we notice is if there's a first mover advantage from potentially your company, that might sound nice and so, but it's actually also a risk that comes in. You can better have quite a few competitors out there, because especially the corporates will be more willing to pick your ingredient then, or that one of the competitor, than when there's no competitor at all, because you have to see that they have to do quite some R&D work before they actually change a recipe or bring a new product to market. It's not that directly once you reach out to a company like, hey, we want you to list our ingredients and to use it, that within a month they will include it. No, it's a process of sometimes a year or 2 years before you actually see your ingredient being used in their product, because they might need to have new listing at retailers, which they have to wait for half a year or a year. They have to do the R&D work of how your ingredient will be used into their final product. So all these elements you should really keep in mind and influence also your timelines, obviously. And once then a corporate is going to be listed at a retailer and you share with them that you don't have an ingredient available, if there's no competitor, they have no other option to go to, and they will have to do the whole formulation of their product again. So I hope this explains a bit of the logic between why we recommend two steps or two-stage approach between pilot and full production. Then the other element I was talking about is the in-house sales team versus a distributor instead of a sales agent. Actually, an in-house sales team enables you to have more control over your client contact because, of course, you're directly in contact with your client. So you know what kind of feedback they provide, what their most typical needs are, and so on. And you can also support them better in that way. I will show the next slide some supporting services that you have to consider depending on how far integrated you are in the value chain. But definitely useful to support your client because that will enable that they will stick longer and you can help them in the best way. But of course, there are also risks to that because the credibility might not be there already if you're a new company. So that would really make it difficult when you go to reach out for potential customers. You might not be that trustworthy yet because your brand name is not out there. It takes a lot of time to build those relationships while a distributor already has those. Also, the R&D and the application lab that you need to develop might be expensive or you have to rent it all the time. And there's logistics required, and it's not that you will only supply it once a year. No, you will need to have continuous logistic or distribution to your clients because they will run several production batches, of course, maybe even once a week or even every day. And lastly, it takes, of course, high investment costs because you have to hire all those employees in, they have to get the knowledge and all those laboratory work and so that you have to do. It's pretty expensive. So that's also why we show a distributor model here is the distributor can buy from you and supply it also to their clients. So basically they have a whole network of clients. Depending on where your ingredient fits best into, they will recommend you or they will recommend the ingredient to their clients. This helps. So there's a shorter time before you actually get listed at certain or get sales from certain customers. And there are quite some synergies because they are already at that client. They might see opportunities or hear opportunities that you don't hear because you're not at the table with your potential customers. And they can also take care of the distribution because they can handle smaller volumes, which might be very difficult for you, especially if you're a smaller company. But there are limitations because you do not get the direct client feedback and you don't have the understanding directly. So that might make your R&D work more difficult to actually improve your ingredients. Of course, there are costs involved. A distributor will not do this just for free. And they will take typically a margin of 20 to 50%. But it might even be higher if your ingredient is so novel. They might say that it's so risky to get this to the market and that therefore they want to take a bigger cut. And also, who will tell that they actually focus on your ingredient? The first month, they might be super excited because it's so new. But maybe the second and the third month, there are other ingredients coming in and their attention is already shifted to another ingredient. So that's something to keep in mind. You do have to incentivize the distributor as well to keep your ingredient warm and to sell it. And lastly, the sales team, of course, cannot know what you know about your ingredient. You can tell it to them, you can show it to them, but it will never be as deep as an ambassador as you will be yourself. This might end a bit negative with a distributor model, but we definitely see cases where this is relevant. So that all depends on the strategic decisions that you're going to make. And I hope this will help with some considerations that you have to take. Being mindful of time, and that I do want to answer questions, I will talk you through the last two slides before I'm going to discuss your questions in detail. As I said, there are supporting services you will require when you actually are in the market. So again, there's the value chain with the major 4 steps here. And depending on which position you have in the market, so how far you're integrated, it depends which supporting services you have to offer. So definitely logistics and warehouse is mostly needed anyway, because you anyway need it for your raw material already. And depending on whether you then in the end supply the ingredient all the way to your B2B end customers or not, you might need bigger or different warehouses as well, and maybe even spread over the globe or the country and so on. Packaging is also required as soon as it becomes an ingredient that's ready for sales and distribution. Market research is definitely needed when you first go to market, so not only in the approach that I showed, but definitely later on to continuously update your ingredient. If you supply it, for example, only to the processing partner, then the processing partner will automatically feed you in with market research, or at least with requirements that they need, so you don't really have to do the research yourself on the ingredient specifically. The marketing, we talked about this. I don't have to further explain that, very important. And if you're working with B2B end customers, let's say it will be integrated into a plant-based meat product, you actually have to provide technical and culinary support, most likely as well, to make sure that your client, potential client, will really understand how you tackle or how it can be integrated. So definitely good to do this, because it also makes them more willing to put some time into it when you're first doing this together, and help them out with questions they cannot solve. And then lastly, 3 components that are super important to look at: quality assurance, quality control, sensory tests, all the ways during the whole value chain. Super important to have that in place. The other pieces is, again, the application functionality and nutritional value tests. This is mostly continuous process, because even though you go to market, there will be continuous improvements. You might want to have a new version out there. So I would recommend to not stop when you go to market with your innovation, but to continuously update it, especially since we're talking a novel protein here. And lastly, you will need supporting departments in your organization, such as procurement, legal, and R&D. R&D, obviously, no reason to talk about that if we just talk application and functionality. But procurement and legal is also important when you start closing deals with your clients. You want to make sure that's good in place and you're not getting any issues with that later on. Then lastly, the timeline. This is indicative, as mentioned on the slide, because it all depends on whether you're going to do all of this in-house, whether you work with a consulting partner like BGP or another partner, whether you hire some freelancers in to support you, how big your team is, what kind of resources you have internally available. But to give you an indication, it will definitely take some time before going to market. So we're listing here 8 months already. And we've made some color boxing here, because basically steps 1 to 3, so functionality testing, the chemical testing, and the application testing, we see as one cluster. So that can happen simultaneously already. Then the next chunk of work will be mostly around the value chain analysis, competitor analysis, defining your target markets, and as well as your USPs based on your functionality. Those are all related as well. So it's not, as I said in the beginning, that you should all do one work package, finish it, because actually some of the information will feed into each other and will help you answer the question earlier than you could otherwise. Then the next chunk of work is rather around the market studying, so the market attractiveness, and based on that also your customer segmentation. A lot of work can be done there at the same time. And that also counts for your brand strategy, which builds upon, of course, the customer segmentation. And based on the customers that you are targeting, so maybe it's startups, or maybe your full production, you're going to target the FMCGs, and maybe your product is more in the premium range, you will see that back reflecting into your customer segmentation. So that input is needed to define your brand strategy and your brand in general, as well as the pricing and the SKUs combined with that. And then you're going to market. And of course, there's a work package to be done around the distribution and the sales, which will help you already based on the value chain you analyzed. But the go-to-market process is basically endless, right? And you might have to do all this work at some point again, because you feel that you don't have the right market fit, or your functionality is not that relevant in the market again. So it's not a one-step, one-time approach. This will come in every few years again, based on the market trends that you see and the market research you're doing, or the feedback you're getting from clients. That's where I want to end with today. I will now open up for any questions. And before I do so, I want to thank also my colleague Oliver for supporting me on this presentation. And he's here today. And he will also be at the meetup later on, where he can have some chats with you as well. But other than that, I'm happy to take some questions now. And if we can't answer yours, then feel free to reach out to our email or LinkedIn.
Yeah, thank you so much, Flor, for that incredible presentation. There was so much information packed into that. And just a reminder to everyone, if you could enter your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat, that will help us keep track of everything a little bit better. And our first question today for you, Flor, really goes back to your go-to-market strategy framework slide. And this person's asking, how do you actually develop a customer need analysis as described in point number 6 on that slide?
Yeah, so let's maybe go back to the slides that everyone has it in front of him or her. So indeed, define your target market, and that will already tell you as well. If you know, for example, that your market is bakery, and in the bakery market we see, and you already know that you're targeting egg white replacement. I've talked this example a couple of times because we see so many interest of that, and I'm sure here in the audience there are some people with egg white replacement as well. So you know, egg white currently animal-based has quite some issues. And with talking to some of the companies that are currently using it or experts in the market, you can find those pain points that they have. So I would really recommend to have a close market connection to hear about pain points in the market currently happening. For example, they want to have more sustainable ingredients. It needs to be cheaper maybe, or maybe the price doesn't really matter, but it's rather that it has to be organic. And currently the organic supply is not in place. So you could provide in that sense already more healthy, more organic products. So those are typical things that we see. And especially when we work at Bright Green Partners, we do a lot of expert calls and a lot of company calls. So we have a close connection to the market and we feed our clients with those customer needs later on. And that comes back in again when you do your customer segmentation. You, of course, have to validate that the customer segments you're addressing have exactly still the same needs. So there might be some iteration happening. But generally, we see that the major points are tackled by that.
Thanks, Flor. And just a reminder to everyone, we will be posting a recording of this presentation to YouTube, and we will be emailing this recording and a copy of the slides to everyone who registered. So you'll be able to revisit all of this fantastic information. Our next question here. How different is ingredient versus product in the application marketing in a B2B environment? So what are you really positioning based on the target market? Is it the ingredient and what it can do, or is it the product made from this ingredient?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we see quite some differences in that. Before that, I would say always start with the ingredient at least, because you have to know what's inside your ingredient and that's what you're providing. But it might not be the total solution, because indeed it might be the case that your ingredient is so novel and so new that it addresses a whole type of new product. So then in that sense, definitely go for the product setup. But in most of the cases that we see is that companies are at the moment really trying to replace an animal-based ingredient. At least that's what we see in our work in the alt protein space. And then it's heavily reliant on the ingredient side. And they will figure out based on the ingredient that they are replacing, what type of product they're actually addressing. So that's the most typical setup we see. But from a customer point of view, they are, of course, thinking, where can I use this ingredient into? So if you really have to know the answer to that question, because if you go to one of the bigger FMCGs, for example, a retailer, they are thinking product and they need to have a solution to their product, and that's your ingredient.
Thank you. And next we have a fairly open-ended question. Where do you see the biggest market opportunity?
In B2B novel food ingredients, where not basically. But if I should really narrow that down, I would not mention a specific type of ingredient that you target, but I would bring it back to the functionality. It's not, it has a reason that it's number one on our list in our framework here. We've seen so many good initiatives of companies who bring novel sources to the market, but if it doesn't add a value and it's just a just another ingredient. If it's just going to be another soy, then amazing. But if it doesn't really bring anything new, then why would people shift? Because it brings a lot of cost with shifting to another ingredient. So really make sure that your functionality is on point. Otherwise, companies are not even going to work with you. So you have to prove the facts that they are even willing to have that first chat with you. So basically, there are endless opportunities. If your functionality is right and you can bring another USP compared to current solutions already out there in the market, such as it's vegan, it's cheaper, it's more sustainable, and so on, then you definitely have a good selling point.
It's a great point, especially regarding the functionality. And for our next question, are there any specific companies that you would hold up as a great example in this space for other folks out there to follow their example?
I will not tell just one company. I want to be unbiased in that way, but I think most of the companies, if we talk, for example, the egg white, there are so many initiatives currently popping up. Clara, I always forget the new name, of course, but that's a company that has been working on it for a long time in the past. But there are so many, I think even Protein Brewery, for example, is here in the audience today. There's Lambda, so duck meat companies who are working on this as well. So from all sorts of directions in the market, I have to say that there are initiatives coming up. I forget to mention the cultured meat companies at the moment who target different examples, but I'm definitely excited if we more look towards 2030, what would be able to get into the market then. And currently we're mostly talking how to replace a typical ingredient, but I'm mostly excited what else we can do. My personal interest to this market is rather how can we make people eat more healthy food rather than just replacing something that's maybe actually not that healthy and it wasn't that healthy in the past. So I'm super excited to see how we can feed the world by better products than there are currently out there. And I think there's definitely still some work to be done there. And it's good that we have over 500 people signing up today, because I'm sure there will be a lot of people in the audience actually working on this.
Absolutely. And moving on, do you think a brand should launch B2B and B2C products at the same time, presuming that they have an innovative product, or should they pursue a B2B model first to gain trust?
It all depends on which skill you already have. If you are a corporate, it might actually make sense, and you could have two setups to get to the size and the scale of that particular ingredient that you need. So then it could be the case because you have already your brand department out there, so who can maybe have and the products out there where you can feed it into. And of course, don't forget that it's always a subcomponent of a product. So it's not necessarily that your ingredient is a product on itself. Most of the times it's not. And then if you are that corporate with the both routes already there, then you could also feed it, of course, into B2B sales to supply to other companies. But maybe you want to keep it rather secretive, because if it has such a big impact on your product, then you might not want to sell it. But that depends on which ingredient you're bringing to market and the value of it. I would say if you are a startup or scale up, your team is smaller, your resources, also financial, are smaller. You cannot do everything at the same time. And therefore, I would say keep your focus, prove that you're successful in that market first, build it out, get traction, make sure the investors are still on board with you to actually show it before you're overwhelming everyone, including yourself, with all the work that comes with it. Because already all these 12 steps that you see on the slide and the timeline that we showed, and that's just for B2B. And for one ingredient, if you have several ingredients, maybe that's quite a lot of work, I would say already. But feel free to challenge me.
And what advice would you offer if your distribution channel partners are seeking exclusivity with your ingredient?
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. It depends if you can also get an agreement of an amount that they are willing to buy, or a certain price to a longer time, because it might be the case that there are more competitors coming in so that the price would be brought down. I think some kind of exclusivity is something most of the times you cannot avoid, but you can, of course, limit to certain regions, so geographies, to certain types of industries, certain type of clients that they can only have, and then you could still work with another distributor, let's say in another country or another geographic region, so that also for you, you can spread your own risk, or maybe you can do still partly yourself and they can do maybe the bigger companies that are more demanding, and you can do the smaller companies first yourself. So don't just go in there with like, oh yeah, we'll give you worldwide full exclusivity. You also have your ingredient that they want to list. So be aware of the power that you also have yourself. So it's a bit of give and take, I would say. And if it feels like a really bad deal, then probably there's another option out there as well. So don't just take the first deal on the table. Make sure that you compare a few so that you know where you can and cannot have bargaining power on.
That's great advice. And based on your experience, should a brand with novel ingredients use a skimming penetration pricing strategy when it comes to B2B?
Yeah, we do see some difference in pricing, but I would say rather come in with a realistic price at first, and not too high, not too low, and also not too much in different markets, because increasing your price is very hard. We see that all over the world at the moment, right? Whether it's in retail, whether it's B2B, with all the prices going up and the shortages, those are some tough discussions that most of the companies are currently having around price. You don't want to go having a discussion that it has to go up. You don't want to come in with a too high price because you outprice yourself, basically. You don't even get a chance to talk. Also, we had this discussion with earlier clients around whether they should have different prices in different markets. And it might be the case if your ingredient is being used in such different markets, it might work. But in the end, especially if you work with distributors or blenders, they talk. Even the FMCGs, if you give them different prices, they talk. Nowadays, there are so many ways, network events where everyone bumps into each other again. People will be aware of this. So I would not have too many different pricing strategies unless there's really a difference. If you have a totally different SKU with different purity, maybe for your product, or you supply someone with very high ranges compared to you have to supply everyone with a kilo every week. Of course, there's a different price there. So that you have to consider. But generally, I wouldn't have for every client a different price because it will be difficult.
Got it. And in your view, what is a reasonable budget needed to roll out a good go-to-market plan?
Oh, I'm not going to make a statement here on that because it all depends on the team you already have internally, the work you've done, whether you have laboratory access. For example, you actually have that in-house, you have your own lab. A lab can easily be 20, 30 million US dollars on CapEx. You need to have a team there. If you work with a CMO or CRO, for example, that can be expensive by itself as well. So already that, and then all the strategy people that you need, the chats, so the time investment to do all the chats with the companies to get the good market feeling. It totally depends if you want to go for like a quick and dirty go-to-market, and you think like, yeah, I come from this industry. I'm a founder. I've been working now for 30 years in the food ingredient industry. I know exactly who my target audience is, versus when you just come from university and you actually done great research on this novel ingredient, but you have no clue on how the rest will work. So that totally depends.
Great. And we have time for just one more question today. How would you approach other startups if you're a startup yourself? What value do startups bring compared to larger corporate players?
Generally, what we see, we work a lot, not necessarily we do a lot of projects for startups, but we are in close touch with them and always make sure that you highlight the win-win for it. Even if it's just a conversation or going to be testing, not even supplying in the end, and there can already be great value in it for you, but they also can have great value because of the testing that you help them with. So that could already be a win-win. So I would always look at it from a win-win perspective. Then the best case is, of course, that you can get a deal, but already insights that you learn from having that discussion with them is going to be great. And that's way better. Of course, that you're talking the same language, you're a bit in the same level of your company, than when you have to pitch for 5 sales guys at a corporate. That's going to be a different discussion. And then you better test first with the startups, make sure that you had the win-win set up there. But it's also kind of testing for you before you try to close the really big deals.
Great. Well, that's about all we have time for today. Flor, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fantastic presentation. I know we all learned so much. We will be sharing a recording of this, and we'll be sending that via email later today. And now please join us over on Meetaway to continue the conversation. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks, everyone, for joining today.